David, first of all, I'd like to begin asking you why this subject of cultural patrimony is of any relevance to a non-academic person.
Well, I think anyone that goes to an art museum or has gone to an art museum knows how wonderful it is to be able to look at beautiful works of art from all over the world, not just from their own civilization, but from all over the place. And those works of art belong to the museums, or they belong to people who are lending them to the museums. So I think it's a reasonable question for people to ask themselves when they look at beautiful works of art, where did they come from?
Mm-hmm.
How did they get to be here? Even if they're modern works of art and they're from known artists, it's still an interesting question. But it's especially pertinent when you're asking about old art that was manufactured centuries or even thousands of years ago. So all of that material represents cultural heritage. Heritage can be a much broader subject, but for our purposes, let's just focus on what's inside of great museums, like the St. Louis Art Museum, for
Exactly.
example. Great museum.
Are there ethical and economic issues associated with this whole cultural patrimony issue that we now see talked about so often?
Well, okay, cultural heritage, meaning the legacy of the past or the present to us in the form of culture. Patrimony implies that something is owned by somebody, and patrimony is normally associated with countries, or with states, with peoples. So cultural patrimony isn't necessarily the same thing as cultural heritage, because if you go to a museum and you look at beautiful works of art, they may or may not be from your own ancestral group. They may be from somebody else's ancestral group. In which case, do they constitute part of your patrimony? Well, if they're in your state or in your city, you could say, well, they're part of my patrimony as a person living here. But other people would claim that because they were made by ancestors of their people on another part of the planet, for example, that they're actually patrimony of somebody else. So if the object comes from China or from Egypt or from Central America where I work, it could be the cultural patrimony of the peoples of those areas. So.
Now, a lot of these works of ancient art are categorized as unprovenanced. Could you explain what provenance means?
Well, provenance is a technical term in art history, and it means the history of the ownership of an object, basically, or where the object came from. In archaeology, and I'm an archaeologist, we use the term provenience, and provenience refers to where the object was found. Well, we're scientifically controlled excavators. We go in and we find things, and we record very precisely where we found them. That's provenience information. Provenance is a different matter. It can be just a history of who owned an object, and you may not know exactly how it got to the first owner. Or sometimes you might have a vague story, or sometimes you might even have exact information. But provenance can be, for example, how the object was collected. If it was an art object made by modern people, provenance could be the different people who've owned it before it was donated to a museum. So provenance matters to art because people want the art to be legitimately in the possession of the museum that you're inside of, or of the people who have lent it to the museum, and not illegitimately in the possession of those places. So provenance is in part a question of deciding, is a piece okay to be in a museum?